There's a food that can genuinely help with insulin sensitivity that measurably lowers some of the inflammation markers tied to type 2 diabetes, and that most people managing diabetes have been told to feel guilty about touching. That food is chocolate. Every week I hear some version of the same question: can I ever eat chocolate again? And the honest answer isn't no. It's that it depends entirely on which chocolate, a distinction you can spot on any grocery store label in about 30 seconds once you know what you're looking for. Some chocolate has a glycemic index in the low 20s, less than a third of what white bread scores, along with compounds that peer-reviewed research links to improved insulin sensitivity and reduced inflammation. That chocolate is sitting on a shelf near you right now, and the person who doesn't know the difference is either avoiding something that could genuinely help them or eating the wrong version and wondering why their numbers aren't moving. I'm Joshua Smith, and today I'm walking through 5 specific types of chocolate. The evidence actually supports for people managing blood sugar, the mechanism behind each one, the research behind those mechanisms, and the label tricks that trip up almost everyone. If precise, mechanism-based health information like this is useful to you, subscribe so more of it finds you. Before the 5 types make sense, it helps to know what actually separates cacao from other sweet foods. Cacao is unusually concentrated in a class of plant compounds called flavanols, especially catechin and epicatechin. And there are 3 documented ways these compounds interact with blood sugar regulation. The first is improved insulin sensitivity through better blood vessel function. Cacao flavanols support the health of the cells lining blood vessels, which affects how efficiently the rest of the body can actually receive an insulin signal and pull glucose out of the bloodstream. Insulin resistance is fundamentally a communication problem between insulin and the cells that are supposed to respond to it, and supporting that vascular lining is one documented way to help that signal come through more clearly. The second is a reduction in oxidative stress. Cacao ranks among the highest antioxidant capacity foods that have been measured, and oxidative stress is one of the central drivers of insulin resistance, since cells under oxidative stress become less responsive to the insulin that is present. The third mechanism is the one still earliest in its research, so it's worth being direct about where the evidence actually stands. Epicatechin has been studied for whether it can help protect the insulin-producing beta cells in the pancreas, and there's older research in diabetic animal models showing it can support the recovery of those cells after damage, along with more recent cell-based studies showing it protects beta cell function against oxidative stress. That's genuinely promising, but it's mostly animal and cell research rather than human trials, so treat it as an active area of study rather than a settled human effect. Here's the point that matters most. These compounds live in the cacao itself, not in a milk chocolate bar built mostly from sugar and hydrogenated fat, with a small amount of actual cacao mixed in. The difference between a product that actually delivers these compounds and one that doesn't is visible on the label in under 30 seconds, if you know what to check. Let's go through the 5 types. The first is dark chocolate at 70% cacao or higher, the most accessible entry point. Glycemic index testing consistently puts 70% dark chocolate somewhere in the low to mid-20s, well under half of white bread's score in the low 70s, and meaningfully below white sugar's score in the 60s. The mechanism is straightforward. At 70% cacao, there's substantially less sugar than in conventional chocolate, and what's left is mostly cacao fat and fiber, both of which slow digestion and blunt how fast any sugar reaches your bloodstream. Some of the clinical evidence behind this comes from studies on cocoa flavanols and vascular function specifically. And separately, research has tied regular cacao consumption to reduced cardiovascular risk, which matters more for people with diabetes given they already carry elevated cardiovascular risk from the condition itself. The dose most studies use is 20 to 30 grams a day, roughly 2 to 3 squares, which is where benefit shows up without a meaningful glucose response. The label trap. Plenty of products marketed as 70% dark chocolate still list sugar before cacao on the ingredient panel. Check the ingredient list, not the front of the package. Cacao mass or cacao paste needs to be the first ingredient. If sugar comes first, the product isn't delivering what the front label implies, regardless of what percentage is printed on it. The second type is dark chocolate at 85% cacao or higher, and this isn't just a more intense version of the first, it's a meaningfully different dose. At 85%, flavanol concentration runs substantially higher, and sugar content drops to somewhere around 10 to 14 grams per 100 grams. compared to 20 to 25 at 70%, meaning both a lower glycemic impact and a higher dose of the protective compounds per serving. There's real clinical research behind this specific range. One randomized trial gave 60 patients with type 2 diabetes and hypertension 25 grams a day of 83% dark chocolate containing about 450 milligrams of flavonoids for 8 weeks, and found improvements in blood pressure and a trend toward better fasting glucose and HbA1c compared to a white chocolate placebo group. A separate trial using chocolate around 84% cacao found measurable reductions in the inflammatory markers CRP, interleukin-6, and TNF-alpha in people with type 2 diabetes, markers directly tied to the chronic low-grade inflammation behind insulin resistance. Worth being precise here, these are 2 separate studies, not one, and results across this body of research are mixed. Some trials find these effects, and some don't, which is part of why researchers still describe the evidence as promising rather than conclusive. Separately, and worth mentioning since it's one of the better-known pieces of chocolate research generally, a large Swedish cohort study out of the Karolinska Institute followed over 37,000 men for a decade and found the highest chocolate consumers had roughly a 17% lower risk of stroke than non-consumers, with a meta-analysis of several studies putting the figure closer to 19%. Worth noting, that particular study wasn't specific to dark chocolate. In Sweden, about 90% of chocolate eaten is milk chocolate, so it speaks more to cacao and flavanols broadly than to any one type specifically. The practical dose for 85% chocolate is 20 to 25 grams daily, and the more intense, less sweet flavor at this percentage tends to naturally support portion control since satisfaction arrives faster per gram. The third type is 100% cacao chocolate and cacao nibs, the zero added sugar end of the solid chocolate category. 100% chocolate has no added sugar, no added milk solids, nothing beyond what's naturally in the cacao bean, and it's genuinely bitter, something that usually takes a few days of exposure to adjust to. Glycemically, it's about as safe as solid chocolate gets, essentially zero available carbohydrate, just cacao fat, fiber, and the highest flavanol concentration of any processed form. Cacao nibs, fragments of roasted cacao bean before further processing, go a step further, since they haven't been through the refining steps that reduce some of the bioactive compound content, so they deliver those protective compounds about as directly as food gets, with close to zero glycemic impact. In practice, these work better as an ingredient than a standalone snack. A teaspoon of nibs stirred into plain yogurt or 10 grams of 100% chocolate melted into natural almond butter delivers the flavanol benefit without much of a glycemic footprint at all. The fourth type is sugar-free chocolate sweetened with erythritol or stevia, useful for people who want a flavor closer to conventional chocolate without meaningful glycemic impact. Erythritol has a glycemic index close to zero. It's roughly 70% as sweet as table sugar, but absorbed through a different pathway and excreted largely unchanged, without producing a meaningful blood sugar or insulin response at normal intake. Stevia gets to a similar place through a different route, since steviol glycosides aren't metabolized in a way that raises blood glucose. Here's the label trap that actually matters most in this category. A lot of products marketed as sugar-free use maltitol as the primary sweetener instead of erythritol or stevia, and maltitol is a genuinely different animal, with a glycemic index commonly cited around 35 to just over 50 depending on the form, high enough to raise blood sugar meaningfully at normal portions, especially compared to something reading essentially zero. Plenty of sugar-free chocolate sold in the US uses maltitol without making that especially obvious on the front of the package. Read the ingredient list specifically for the sweetener used. Erythritol and stevia are what you're looking for. Maltitol isn't a safe substitute if you're managing blood sugar. The fifth type is unsweetened cacao powder, and it has both the strongest evidence base and the highest flavanol concentration per gram of any form cacao comes in. A systematic review examining 7 clinical trials on cocoa flavonoids and blood sugar control in people with type 2 diabetes found that daily intake in the range of 25 to 30 grams of cocoa products over roughly 8 weeks was tied to improvements in fasting glucose in some trials, with one trial also showing an HbA1c improvement and another showing reductions in inflammatory markers alongside increases in HDL cholesterol in a few. The review is appropriately cautious about it too, since results were mixed across the 7 trials and several carried a meaningful risk of bias, so this is described as promising evidence, not proof. HbA1c specifically is worth flagging because it reflects average blood sugar control over roughly 3 months. So any documented movement on that specific marker from a dietary change is a more durable signal than a single blood sugar reading. Cacao powder outperforms solid chocolate on flavanol concentration because the pressing, conching, and tempering steps used to make solid chocolate degrade some of those compounds along the way. So a tablespoon of pure, non-alkalized cacao powder can deliver more flavanols than a full square of 70% chocolate with less fat and fewer calories attached. It works well stirred into unsweetened coffee, into plain yogurt with a touch of stevia, into a smoothie, or into oatmeal. The label trap here is the simplest of the 5. The ingredient list should say cacao powder or cocoa powder and nothing else. Skip hot chocolate mixes and flavored cocoa products entirely, including ones marketed as reduced sugar, since they typically carry added sugar or starch that changes the glycemic picture completely. There's a psychological piece to this worth naming directly, since it rarely comes up in these conversations. Research on eating behavior consistently finds that guilt after eating tends to increase how much someone eats afterward, not reduce it. A restriction then overeating cycle that tends to produce worse outcomes over time than a planned, portion-controlled inclusion of the food would have. Someone who understands that 2 squares of 85% dark chocolate after a protein and fiber-rich dinner carries a low glycemic index and delivers compounds actively supporting insulin sensitivity has a genuinely different relationship with that food than someone eating the same 2 squares while believing they're undoing their progress. The knowledge changes the experience, and the experience changes the behavior that follows it. Here's the full picture. 70% dark chocolate, glycemic index in the low 20s, the easiest entry point, 20 to 30 grams a day, cacao is the first ingredient on the label. 85% dark chocolate, higher flavanol dose, lower sugar, real if mixed clinical evidence around inflammatory markers in people with type 2 diabetes, 20 to 25 grams. 100% cacao and cacao nibs. 0 added sugar, the highest flavanol concentration in solid form, best used in small amounts as an ingredient. Sugar-free chocolate sweetened with erythritol or stevia, close to 0 glycemic impact, as long as you check the label for maltitol hiding in the ingredient list. And pure unsweetened cacao powder, the highest flavanol concentration per gram of any cacao form, with the most direct evidence tying it to movement on long-term blood sugar markers. 25 to 30 grams daily, worked into drinks or food, 1 ingredient on the label, and nothing else. Chocolate isn't off the table for someone managing diabetes. The wrong chocolate is. Everything here is meant to inform a conversation with your own doctor or dietitian about how food fits into your specific treatment plan, not to replace medication, monitoring, or medical guidance you're already following, especially since individual response to diet varies quite a bit. If this replaced some guilt with actual clarity, subscribing and sharing it with someone managing diabetes who thinks chocolate is permanently off limits genuinely helps. I'm Joshua Smith, and I'll see you in the next one.